Good morning, everybody. You have a panel of people who all arrived into this hotel in the early hours of the morning, very early hours of the morning. So hopefully those of you out here who were also enjoying the party last night will identify with a sense of a discussion of what we have titled The Cost of Cheap Food, which is an interesting title since it implies an assumption that healthy food is somehow more expensive, and that is actually one of the things that we need to talk about. I'm here with Rowan Douglas, who is the CEO of Climate Risk and Resilience for Howden Group, and I've known Rowan for many years as somebody who has constantly pointed to the need to bring together science, which is the core of the Yeat Lancet report, policy and capital, and the way in which those three things have remarkably aligned needs and incentives to engage if we can bring them together. And Jemilah Mahmood, who is the Executive Director of the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health in Malaysia, whom I met earlier this year at a conference on tipping points, and where we were both engaging on the question of how might we take some of the learnings around planetary system tipping points and apply them to ourselves, and think about positive tipping points. So we're here to talk about the hidden costs, indeed, of unhealthy and unsustainable food systems, food production, diets, and health. But we are really here to try to take that further into the question of where are there a set of lesser known, latent or explicit instruments for making that cost come forward and for acting upon it, bringing that cost in to the kind of decision support we need to shift capital into investing in much cheaper, healthy diets and much more sustainable food systems. So Jemilah, I'm going to start with you. You've worked across the health system, you are a physician, you've worked for 25 years in humanitarian air support. What do you see? I know you've seen many examples of the hidden costs of climate change affecting health and nutrition. What's your number one learning from that? What are examples of this?
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Good morning, everyone. Let me tell you a story of some of the conversations that I've had on the Pacific island of Marshall Islands, where the highest point in the island is 9 meters above sea level. People there have had to tolerate climate change, but also rising seas. As a result of salt intrusion, they've lost a lot of their normal crops, taro and so forth, but also very much harder now to catch fish off coastal the shores. And so what has happened is a shift in the diet to one that is mainly processed food and fast food, and has led to another crisis, from a climate and food crisis to a health crisis, where the triple sort of terrible triad of obesity, diabetes, hypertension becomes the norm. And 75% of people in the Pacific Islands are suffering from this. So when we talk about the costs or the cost of cheap food, it's never cheap. There is a health cost and hidden costs to the climate crisis and the food crisis. And unless we think in these systems, we will always be unable to meet the demands and the needs and the justice that is really a responsibility for all, intergenerationally, but also people who are the most vulnerable.
Thank you. And this is interesting because it's playing a spectrum across from the individual and individual health. And as I thought about many hours of sleep, someone sent me a WhatsApp message with a picture that said, everything is super important until you're sick. Then you realize that there's only ever one thing that was important, your health. And I thought about that as I set myself in the shower and thought about sleep hours. I'm coming to you, Rowan, on the other end of this spectrum, which is the production of food. You've just been working for the European Commission with the European Investment Bank on helping Europe think about where might some of the true risks and costs sit with the production of food. Tell us about that work.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and it's wonderful to be at this remarkable event, but particularly as it's new for me, because I'm something rather, I guess, odd here. I'm a reinsurance broker. So I was a geographer who found themselves working in finance, originally Lloyd's of London and now Howden Group. And reinsurers have to manage extremes, and to do that we've had to sort of embrace the modelled world over the last 30 years and not sort of understand what has happened in the past, although that's critical, but understand what could happen. And that makes your insurance policy sort of viable and secure. And based on that, when we price insurance policies and make insurance companies and governments resilient, we have to simulate about 10,000 years of potential 2026 or look ahead to 2050. And that's what the EU asked us to do on the back of the Future of Food report that Ursula von der Leyen launched about a year ago. And we basically simulated the risks to European yields now and into the future. And the exam question was also, are farmers protected, and will they be protected in the future? And to give you the headlines, it was shocking. Annual average yields in the EU are losing 6% of yields every year are being lost on average. Most years are less than that, some are more, and some are a lot more. That's 28 billion euros of lost yield every year. A bad year can be up at 12% of EU yields now. Of course, that's across the whole of the EU, right from the top of Sweden here down to the tip of Portugal. In particular regions, each year they'll be much worse. By 2050, it's quite foreseeable to see a loss of 100 billion euros of yield in the EU. And guess what? 80% of that falls on farmers. We do not share the risks of the food on our plate, which is why we are going to, which is why the average age of a European farmer is now 61 years old. Very rare do you find the offspring of farmers who are considering going full-time into farming. They may do it on the side and have a sort of a normal job. And we'll come on, I think, in the next part of the show as to how we can use insurance in its broadest abstract sense as a mechanism for both sharing but also navigating a sustainable path both for food production but also, of course, on the health side for a sustainable way of sharing our health risks as well.
Thank you, and let's indeed come to that. And I want to just throw in, just thinking through one of the things that we know is so critical, and Jemilah, you are really passionate about this, is taking a systemic perspective. Jacqueline McGlade in University College London did a longitudinal research on the big years of famine and malnutrition in sub-Saharan Africa and found that if you are extremely malnourished from the age of 0 onwards, you lose the development of the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, which is responsible for our affiliative responses. So that possibility, if you think forward, of food crises and food yield loss and significant malnutrition being essentially a ticking time bomb for humans able to bring their most affectionate affiliate selves to one another. So let's shift into this question of we need to take a systemic view. There are costs that are latent in climate change, costs that are latent in the way in which we have food systems managed and protected. How does an insurer, noticing or modeling that kind of risk, act to make it change? How do we actively get farmers to do the right thing, to grow food in more sustainable ways? What are the mechanisms that the insurance industry can bring to bear?
Okay, so my aim now is to shock you, okay? So we're all a bit tired, I can tell. So I'm going to wake everyone up. Believe it or not, insurance, in its broadest sense, is probably your biggest friend as an institution of society to navigate the transition we need, all right? So the first thing I'm going to say is when we think of insurance, we tend to think of just the industry, the private industry, where you get your house insurance from or your car insurance. And it is that, but it is much more than that. Insurance is the ultimate community product. It is the essence of a civilized society at local and global scales. It basically says, what is it that we collectively value? We may collectively value health protection. We may collectively value pensions in our old age. I'm here in the Nordic region, the birthplace of the ultimate social contract. We may value secure shelter. Great Fire of Stockholm in 1759 led to transformation in how we manage our urban morphology to reduce risk, and part of that was driven by a very early Swedish insurance system. That's an amazing thing. We put money in a collective pot with no guarantee that we will get anything back ourselves, but we have the collective entitlement to funds if defined events occur. My house burns down, I reach 65, I become unwell. That's an amazing thing. And through the incredible system of reinsurance, we share risk around the world. But to make that pot of money sustainable and affordable for us all, we have to manage the risk. We have to do that ourselves if we're a farmer, maybe through what we may intervene in terms of hail nets or whatever, but ultimately we also have to manage risk at a societal level through, yes, building codes and fire departments, or in the case of our work on farming, we saw essentially how critical drought risk was going to be in the EU. And by quantifying the risk and allocating where that falls, we have provided a set of contingent liabilities across the system. Who bears the risk? The farmer, the governments, the insurance sector. And once you've defined those contingent liabilities, essentially you've taken the medical, then everything you do to reduce those contingent liabilities has an economic benefit because it reduces those liabilities to whom they fall.
And it keeps the insurance
Exactly.
business in business.
It keeps the insurance business in business, but it actually enables this ultimate community product to flourish. Now, my disappointment is in the last 50 years or so, the respect for this institution of insurance, both within my own industry, but actually in the broader domain, has been incredibly eroded. But actually, we've got to relearn the lessons, many of which were actually discovered in this region of the world, and apply it, yes, to ensure that we reduce the risks to farmers and farming so we can produce our food sustainably, produce the right food to make sure that that production isn't actually leading to a whole load of health consequences further down the chain. And if we can use both the mathematics but also the governance mechanisms of insurance, both in the public sector, the private sector, and the mutual sector, I think we can actually retrain the invisible hands to integrate the risk, to then apply that to shape the value and the protection that we need. And I really hope we can bring our worlds of the industry I'm lucky enough to be part of, and the tremendous agenda that you have developed over recent years, and actually come together and drive that through public and private systems.
Thank you. So I think that's a massive call to action and an opportunity. But let's widen that for the fact that one of the challenges implicit in that is that insurance applies in areas of the world where there's a highly rigorous contracting and governance system. That's not always the case in the Global South, Jemilah, right?
No.
So what's your perspective on how we use these governance instruments for more systemic thinking and responses?
Sure. And absolutely, Kirsten, in my part of the world, the developing world and middle-income countries, insurance is not as prevalent as it is in the global north. I come from Malaysia, where we always, tell ourselves we have the best climate and all that. Well, not really. Now we have the impacts of climate change, and we're seeing this firsthand now. So what we have done is really worked very hard. When I say we, it's a group of us who really engage with the government to say we need to have a new approach now, a systems approach to addressing the inextricable link between the health of human civilization and the planet. And what we've been able to do is to bring health into the discussion central, using the opportunity of the pandemic, and saying that we need a national planetary health action plan. How do we live within the planetary boundaries? But this requires a complete revamp on governance, on finance, on health, on environment, on social justice and rights, and putting people at the center of everything we do. So I'm very, very happy that we will be launching our National Planetary Health Action Plan next month. This is going to be the first in the world. And what it will require us is mandating governments, ministries to rethink how they work with each other, but bringing in community, bringing in the private sector, bringing in industry, indigenous voices and so forth, and young people. Because unless and until we integrate all this, especially the private sector, because in a country like Malaysia, which is middle income, aspiring to be high income, we are driven by small, medium enterprise, and the food industry is a big one. But the other thing also, looking at the financial systems and the insurance and so forth, we are not, we don't have national health insurance. We don't have, public insurance as you do in Sweden and in Scandinavia. But what we do is we can unlock capital from Islamic finance, which is very prevalent in my part of the world. And it's a huge capital. We're talking about trillions of dollars. And it can also be a social capital, because you can make it a social contract through the instruments we have, Waqaf, Zakat, and so forth, which are in the trillions. But also using new innovative mechanisms where we take, the Islamic bonds and blend it with, the mainstream financial capital into impact bonds. Then we have already started to test this on climate, on energy, and I think we can test it on food, and the halal industry, which is a $2 trillion industry. So how now do we regulate industries to make sure that they produce food that is good for the planet, good for people? So, and the health argument is a very powerful one, because the new World Economic Forum report, for example, has shown the cost to health and the cost to governments when you actually don't look at it through a systems approach. So I think for Malaysia, we are chairing ASEAN this year, a regional bloc, and we are also trying to push, during the chairmanship to the ASEAN countries. Our closest neighbor, Indonesia, it has 350 million people. We can unlock capital through those mechanisms as well. So how do we become more innovative? But more importantly, if I may, Kirsten, we've got to communicate better, because if I say planetary health diet or planetary boundaries in my language or in another language in the global south, it's very, very hard to translate. So, and I think one of the positive tipping points is storytelling. How do you paint a picture to governments, to policymakers, to financial institutes, to the private sector, that it is in your interest that we revamp the way we think, the way we do business, the way we finance, and the way we include young people, indigenous voices, and so forth. And it's a very, very different environment in the global south.
And that's something I think you were naming, Rowan, as well. And Jemilah, thank you so much. This notion of how do you get to a sense of shared responsibility and shared burden, but shared opportunity between farmers and consumers, between governments and civil society. What's your sense of, I remember when I was working a while back in insurance, there were mechanisms, early mechanisms in personal health insurance that were really actively helping people see, if I make these actions, I pay less, I feel better. How much of that is still alive and working? How do we draw that into the food systems conversation?
You confessed your past, Kirsten. You had a career in insurance.
Yeah.
That's where we met. Okay, I want to get practical, if I may, for a moment. Confessions of an underwriter. Okay. What was exciting for me personally when we did this work for the Euro Commission, it's all out there. Just Google insurance, agriculture, climate, and it's a copious report. And I was born so many years ago that it was the week that we saw the other side of the moon. It was 1968. So there was a mission to see the other side of the moon, but no one remembers the picture of the other side of the moon. Everybody remembers the picture of the Earth that they took from the moon. It was the Earthrise picture, symbolized much of what we've been doing. We did tell the European Union how little of you European farmers were insured, but what we also did to understand the risk was do the modeling. And I think for the European Commission, to your point, Jemilah, it's been like an X-ray and an MRI scan. They've seen the risk to yields and economies and to farmers in a very, very clear and financial way for every crop, every region, every peril. They realize for the first time that frost losses will grow in Europe by 40% in an era of global warming. Why? Because grapes and fruits are flowering and blossoming earlier, which makes them more vulnerable to frosts. So the first, and we're actually doing the same work now for ASEAN nations. So that gives, if you like, a very tangible view on what the risk is, but also what will be required to reduce that risk through resilience and risk sharing. I think what would be exciting for me is if we could combine that sort of analysis, and believe you me, the first priority is to grow food. And there are real risks to our food production in Europe, let alone in the global south. We have to allow our farmers to produce food profitably for all sorts of reasons, both food security and economics. But if at the same time we could amend our system so we were, and I was so impressed with the previous session on procurement, to grow the crops that we will need for the sort of diet that we want, whether it's, as you heard, grains and pulses. And if we modelled the improvement on health outcomes and maybe the reduction in health budgets, that could move at a practical level, we can have this seesaw that says, yes, we will need to spend more money on our farming systems to make them resilient and to make them secure, but we're going to save some money here and bring these two things together. And I am passionate that it's the common pivot of insurance that is going to be the vehicle that allows that to operate across different government departments and indeed across the economy. And if there's something we can do through this incredible forum in perhaps one or two countries which want to be avant-garde, maybe Malaysia, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much. And anybody out there, this is the guy to talk to if you're thinking about making that link. Jemilah, I want to come to this question of storytelling and make a link between this session and the previous session. I do a lot of work trying to help cities transform, and actually one of the biggest challenges is definitely food security, food access, affordability, but it's also mental health.
Yes.
And the extent to which so much of that is one of the deeply, deeply sleeping concerns now starting to come to the fore. Yeah. How do you see, I know as a member of the EAT Lancet Advisory Group, very proud to be here in that capacity. One of the challenges is the huge pushback on the EATS Foundation's work to bring this notion of a healthy diet for people, for the planet, to the fore. How do you see, in a Global South context, the opportunity of telling the story of changing diet? Is it changing diet? Is this notion of somehow more healthy and affordable diets being more sophisticated, more expensive, does that resonate? Do we need to find a different story?
I think so, and I think we need to lean back on culture, on indigenous knowledge, and really powerful storytelling. We as scientists and finance people, we need to bring the arts back into our lives, right? We need to bring values, and those can be very easily translated through music, through art, through culture, to drama, to film. But the other issue, and you touched about the mental health pressure, some of these facts and doom and gloom can become so overwhelming, and for many people, the protective mechanism to that is to doom scroll on TikTok or whatever, and the don't look up phenomena, right? Because it's just too difficult. But until we start telling a story of hope, of positive tipping points, that it is possible because we have the science, we have the innovation, we have the capital that is available, but we just need to rethink how we communicate that. Certainly, one of the things we've been able to do in Malaysia to reach the public, to reach government, because at the end of the day, it is still politics, because politicians think in very short time frames. How do you get this long-term patient thinking to unlock, the potential of change? And I think this is really through telling stories about people who are impacted by it. As a medical professional who worked, I was the advisor to the government during the pandemic, was really telling the stories not just from the patient perspective, but the health provider, the mental health strain it created, the strain that young people are going through now, with mental health. And I think on food, it's going back to what were we originally eating, which was very much a planetary health diet. So the regulation of the food industry is going to be extremely important. The faster we close down the fast food chains and so forth, that will actually help us to go back. And the notion that a planetary health diet is expensive, because when you talk about planetary health diets to a regular person in Malaysia, they probably say, oh, but I can't afford that. But if you say to them, go back to what your ancestors used to eat, because that was healthy, came from the land, it was mainly plant-based, it was, proteins from different sources, not processed food. I think then it can resonate. And I think people now, we as older people love to reflect on the past, the glorious days of the past, right? And I think we need to bring that in now as something very romantic, something that, everyone has to experience. And I think we can do that. And don't underestimate the power of young people.
So that's really this question of how do we go back to tradition? How do we think and connect food, health, well-being with stability and security,
Yes.
but also opportunity. And think of insurance as this community instrument, as a bastion for societal resilience. Thank you both.
Just one, because I know we're up to time, but two quick things. One is on mental health.
Yeah.
We all know the highest suicide rates in my country and probably yours are amongst farmers. That's an absolute global crisis, and it's up to all of us to. And why are they killing themselves? Because of the risk and insecurity that they face for their farmers, for their families. Well, the final point. I love your point about romance. I have a dream. I have a dream about a new romantic period of finance.
Yes.
I studied.
This is what very little sleep does for you.
Yeah, this is what coming in at 4 o'clock in the morning does. I studied English literature, and I studied the romantic period of English literature where humankind was industrializing, becoming disconnected from nature. And Wordsworth and other poets were determined to reconnect humankind to nature. Maybe we didn't quite manage it the first time round. We are now going to enter a romantic period of finance, where humanity is connected to nature, not through Wordsworth's poetry, but the modelled world and climate risk and credit risk coming together to navigate
the planetary diet
of Thank you.
Thank you.